Welcome to the Black Paper. My name is Ndukwe Onoha.
And I'm Chata Wanze.
How was your weekend, Chata?
Cool, quiet. Had a family gathering. A cousin of mine turned 40, so we had a gathering where multiple generations of my family were together, and it was great.
And
It
I'm
was
sure
really
in
great.
proper Nigerian style, people had a good party.
Yes, we did. We did.
Nigerian party. But anyway, today we want to talk about remembrance, about war, really. Wars fought, wars won, lives lost, lives are being lived now, sacrifices of people, and just how, for some others, their sacrifices are being conveniently swept under the carpet, and how we do need to remember that in the wars that guaranteed our freedoms, it was not just one group of people that fought, it was all of us. So, Cheta, on this Remembrance edition, let's just start off with, why do people celebrate on the 11th of November every year?
Okay. It's interesting that you are wearing a very plastic poppy.
It's metal.
Oh, it's metal. Okay. It looks plastic to me from here. So good craftsmanship. So the poppy symbol came about. Okay, first things first. The day November 11th was picked as Remembrance Day because 107 years ago, that was when the First World War ended. So that thing of the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. So that's basically the armistice that brought about the end of the First World War. And the poppy symbol in the UK was selected because of after the battle at Flanders, there were a lot of poppy flowers that grew where a lot of men died, and so they basically took it as a symbol, and they've used that as the symbol for remembrance every year since then. I think in a lesson that we can pick from back home, remembrance is usually celebrated on the Sunday before November 11th, basically so as not to interrupt the economy. Yeah, I mean, it's a dig that I can't resist taking, because in our neck of the woods, the remembrance will be celebrated. The public holiday would be taken. We would go on holiday on the day whatever day it falls.
I mean, what economy?
Now that's you.
No. What I mean is, when you said basically not to interrupt the economy, and I'm like, okay. I mean, there's a party.
Like I said, that's you being nasty.
No, I don't mean that there's no economy. No, the economy is there.
It's still you being nasty. Anyway, the bottom line is, it's a day of reflection. The narrative is that the soldiers who died in the First and the Second World War fought for freedoms that we enjoy today. I, given the knowledge I've acquired of history, would say that it's more of the soldiers who died in the Second World War that fought for freedoms that we enjoy today. The First World War was not really a war against quote unquote an evil empire like the Nazis and the Empire of Japan. It was more it was more the culmination of a Game of Thrones that went bad. And ultimately created the first industrialized war. And if you move around the UK, you can see that the country still suffers a lot of psychological scars from the First World War, especially. Because the First World War was the first industrialized war. Sorry, it was the second industrialized war. The American Civil War was the first industrialized war. But it was the first industrialized war fought between equal powers, in more or less. In the American Civil War, for example, the North was industrial, the South was agrarian. So the outcome of the war was guaranteed from the get-go. In the wars that followed, they were largely colonial wars. European armies against Africans and Asians who were way behind them in terms of industry and technology. So those were walkovers. I was trying to find another word, but
I mean, there were
so
invasions more than wars.
there were invasions and walkovers. I mean, think about, for example, the punitive expedition in Benin. It was just one gunboat.
Yeah,
and
that's what
then
I'm saying. So you couldn't really call it a war because the other side really didn't put up any resistance, for you to say, well, they were at war.
in terms of the in terms of the actual definition, it was a war. One-sided war, yes, but a war nevertheless.
And sorry, Cheta, just before you talking about the expedition in Benin, I can't but give a shout out to Asoro the Great, the great Benin warrior whose statue is still up in Benin to commemorate his bravery against invading British soldiers. We can talk about that another day, but I just love the history and the myth around Asoro.
Okay, pronounced like an Igbo boy. It's Asoro.
Asoro.
Yeah.
Well,
yes. I grew up in Benin, so and for the record, if I just before we move on from that, if I want to talk about the real heroes of that war between the Benin Empire and the British, the person I would really pick as the hero is Olubushere, but that's another conversation for another day. Now going back to what I was talking about before you interrupted, before your rude interruption.
I only talking about Asoro because I acted as Asoro in school, so I have a thing for Asoro.
You see yourself. Anyway, going back before I allow you to derail me completely.
Sorry.
Yeah, the First World War was a war between armies that had been used to that kind of colonial conquests, unequal battles. So they were fighting armies of equality, as trying to find the right way to express it. They were fighting armies that were at par with them, but using tactics from basically the Napoleonic Wars, which is why the slaughter was so great. So whole towns in the UK, for example, lost the cream of their crop in terms of boys, and eventually they had to lean into empire. They had to lean into India. They had to lean into Africa to bring men into fights. So over the course of the two world wars, about 2 million men of African heritage fought for Britain and France combined, out of about just over 20 million men that were mobilized. So 10%. When you consider the fact that that over the course of the two wars, over the period that the two wars covered, so 1914 to 1945, the share of Africa's population compared to the rest of the world was somewhere between 10 and 15%. It means that we contributed our fair share. So I think what we should talk about a bit is how the contribution of Africans in both wars has been overlooked, because that is a major thing that really gets my goats. We had, for example, Nigeria's first military head of state, Agu Ironsi, fought for the British in Burma. He was a Burma boy. That was the expression, and it was from there that he came back to Nigeria and essentially became NA2. Because Basi was NA1. That's NA1 being the first commissioned officer in the Nigerian army, then NA2 the second commissioned officer in the Nigerian army. It would be nice to talk about people like Johnny Smith, who was an African from Sierra Leone, who was shot down. He was a pilot during the Second World War. He was shot down. There are a lot of Africans who contributed, and I hope to be able to call some of their names during the course of this discussion. One of Badebo Roots Vivo, who is your friend and my friend back in Nigeria, his uncle or grand uncle was killed fighting for the British in the Second World War. So these are people whose sacrifices should not be forgotten or should not be whitewashed away from history, because there's an attempt to paint it like Britain on its own defeated the Germans. Britain drew on its massive empire, which at the start of the First World War was the largest empire in history.
And the thing about empire is quite interesting. When we talk about how Britain drew upon its empire, it wasn't for most parts, it wasn't a willing sacrifice that people made. People were conscripted. So there's a a quote by Yoruba, not Yoruba, but Yoruba, who's a Senegalese veteran. And, he said that he remembers the day that the French came to his village. And these were his exact words. If men had stayed at home, would have been taken to court and probably shot dead. So for a lot of people, fighting the war on behalf of empire, whether it was the British Empire, whether it was the French Empire, whether it was whatever empire there was not a thing of choice. But let's dial back a bit, and I'm sure in the course of this conversation, we'll talk about the consequences or the aftermath for these people who, having fought for empire, went back and realized that the empire almost had no use or no need or no appetite, in fact, for them.
No interest, I think, is a better way to describe
no
it.
interest in them. So, there's a story by someone called Martin Plotz, who's a journalist. He was recalling his canvassing. By that I mean going door to door, knocking, asking people or trying to get votes for his party. He was canvassing on behalf of the Labour Party in Somerstown area of Camden in central London. So he gets to this elderly woman and trying to find out from her which party she will support. And she was like, no, not you people. No, you people only help the blacks. And he tried to explain to her that, look, everyone fought for this country. So if it seems that we're also helping these people, it's because they also fought, and this was, just not necessarily after the war, but just to let her know that these people didn't just come from nowhere. They've contributed to the freedom. And she slammed her door saying, you're lying, you're bloody lying. And it is that thing that people don't know, that really there was more than, as you've mentioned, Cheta, more than the native English population who fought in both wars, in the First World War, in the Second World War. So the question then is, why don't people know that from what we now know as the Commonwealth countries? You had people from Kenya, from all over East Africa, from Zimbabwe, from South Africa, Nigeria. You had Ghanaians supporting in one way or the other. You have the Senegalese, Sierra Leoneans, all joining their efforts. But somehow, whether at home or even here, the war has sort of been whitewashed, and it's almost like these people had no hand in it. Is this deliberate, or is it just an oversight?
Yes, it's deliberate. It's not an oversight. It's deliberate. And I would give an example. This time not British, but French. A lot of people in Africa have not heard of the Thierrye massacre, which happened in 1944. Senegalese soldiers who had been demobilized after France was liberated. So two things that must be brought up here. France was captured by Germany in the Second World War, and to liberate France took a combined effort from the Americans, from the British, starting in D-Day. So everybody has heard of D-Day, 6th of June, 1944. What a lot of people do not know is that there were a lot of black soldiers. So African American soldiers from the British Commonwealth, and black soldiers from the French Empire, mainly Senegalese, who were involved in the battles for France. Ultimately, Paris was liberated from the Germans, I think, 25th of July, 1944.
Sorry, Chair, just hang on before you carry on. So you see, that is quite an interesting point. But if you pick up 10 movies about the invasion,
which is what I want to point out next. When they were doing the parade into Paris after the liberation, after the Germans had withdrawn from Paris, especially the Americans insisted that it should only be white soldiers that should be involved in the parade. So it is from there that the whitewashing started. From there. Now, the Senegalese soldiers were basically demobilized and sent back home. And many of those who have been captured by the Germans earlier in the war, so a lot of Senegalese soldiers, Senegalese and Chadian soldiers especially, were captured by the Germans during the initial offensive into the Ardennes, when Heinz Guderian showed what Blitzkrieg could do and captured France in 28 days. A lot of Senegalese and Chadian soldiers were captured. These people were badly treated by the Germans because the Nazis looked at them as subhuman. Now, 4 years later, those who survived were sent back to Senegal, and they were put in a camp. They were put in a camp in a place called Thierrye in Senegal. And then, at some point, they noticed that the French soldiers were paid 3 times what they were paid, and the French soldiers were never owed. They were being owed back pay. That's even on those lesser wages, they were still being owed. So they decided to protest. And what did the French who were guarding the camp do? They opened fire on them. Now, there are 2 different death tolls. The official French death toll, when you can find, wherever you can find records, because records are scarce, is 35. But Senegalese veterans will tell you that more than 300 were killed. And personally, I would err on the side of the Senegalese in this matter. France has never apologized for it. I think that it was either Jacques Chirac or Emmanuel Macron or Sarkozy, which is a fairly recent president, who acknowledged the Thierrye massacre, but they haven't apologized. When you don't apologize, you can't even begin to talk of compensation.
You know, the truth is, when it comes to French and Africa, I'm oftentimes disgusted by the hypocrisy, let's put it that way, of the French when you talk about either human rights or talk about freedom, as if even now they still don't have their boots on the necks of many African countries.
Oh, there's a reason. There's a reason why the whole thing of Russian involvement in the Sahel is a big thing, and a lot of people in those countries are very open to Russian involvement in their countries. They don't like the French. So I'll give an anecdote. Sorry to move away briefly. 4 years ago, before Russia became officially an enemy to the West, after the invasion of Ukraine, I attended the Moscow Security Conference, and one thing I noticed, so in the Moscow Security Conference that year, 2021, I found it very interesting that the Americans sent only one defense attaché who was already in the U.S. embassy in Russia. The British sent 2 people, if memory serves me. The Germans had a delegation, the biggest delegation, if I can remember, outside of the Russian sphere of influence, all those Belarus, Kazakhstan, those ones had big delegations. The Nigerian delegation, there were 5 of us. The South African delegation was the biggest from Africa. But from Europe, the French delegation was big. The French delegation had, I think, about 10 people. And they all spoke in panels. And one thing I found very interesting, I tweeted about it at the time. Every French person who spoke, so all the other Europeans who spoke, be it British, be it German, be it Danish, they spoke about European geopolitical concerns. But whenever it was time for a French person to speak, they would talk about Africa. They all spoke about, and I found it very, very interesting. And by the time you think about France Afrique and Pax Colonial and all of those things, you find that the French interest in Africa is still very huge, because the former French colonies are a source of cheap materials, cheap raw materials, cheap labor, and cheap money for France. I think it was Mitterrand or Chirac. It was Chirac who admitted that without their former colonies, France would be a third world country. It's actually on record. He said it.
I mean, when you have countries forced to leave 50% of their reserves in the French
65, please, let's be accurate.
Oh wow, okay. So now 65% of their reserves in the French Central Bank, who can make monetary policy or changes to monetary policy without approval from Paris? That tells you that, forget the optics, a lot of African countries are still being colonized today by the French overlords.
Yes. And for the first time, it is me who is trying to drag you back to what we started discussing before this. We will have time. Don't worry. We'll have enough time in future episodes to talk about France.
But the thing is, it's that hypocrisy that, as you've mentioned, you get people from empire, force them to fight for you, then refuse to pay them.
The British did that as well.
Oh,
the British paid their African soldiers about the same proportion, about 3 times less than white soldiers,
and they could never rise above the rank of warrant officer.
All the regiments had to be led by white officers.
Yes.
So in 1916, there were 2 Nigerians. Well, I mean, Nigeria was just 2 years old at the time. So those, Private Samuel Sabongida and Private Adetoro, who were shot because they were given as they were executed. So their memoirs are captured, or the incident is captured in a memoir called "Shot at Dawn." So they were executed for insubordination. Basically, a white officer asked them to do a task that was physically impossible. And they protested, and they were shot. So those kinds of, and this was in the Eastern Front. So these men, now, Sabongida was, Samuel Sabongida, for me, just hearing his name would tell me that he was from what we now know as Edo States, around the Owan area. I don't know enough about Yoruba nomenclature. I mean, both of us know that if, for example, somebody who understands Igbo very well, when he hears a name, he'll be able to tell you what part of Igbo lands the person comes from.
For instance, I was having this exact conversation with someone yesterday.
Yeah.
And I was just saying that my name, sorry, but when I hear my first name, Ndukwe, or my surname, Onaha, I can immediately narrow it down to just 2 states in the southeast.
Yes, so it's pretty much the same thing in so many parts of southern Nigeria. I cannot tell you where Private Adetoro was from because I don't know I don't know in depth about Yoruba. I hope my wife is not hearing me. I don't know that much in depth about Yoruba culture to be able to say. But if I hear a name from the Midwest going eastward, I can pretty much give a fair guess as to where the person was from or is from. And so Private Samuel Sabongida was very likely from an Ibira or an Owan person from around what is now Edo State. For soldiers from northern Nigeria at the time, they simply gave them the names of their villages. So it's why you have names like Kontagora, Bida, as in they were giving those names by the British, just like that.
Now, wasn't it? Sorry, I think a few years ago, it wasn't. I think if memory serves me right, the National Assembly tried to do something about people taking on the names of their villages because it was almost difficult to pin down someone. But memory doesn't serve. But but I know it came up in a discussion in the National Assembly.
It came up in a discussion in the National Assembly. I remember
as their surnames.
It was one of those discussions that I found
of anonymity.
Pardon me? I said it came up in the National Assembly. I remember when it did. It was one of those discussions I found to be ridiculous, because basically the reason why this happened was back in the day, our traditional naming systems were different from the European naming systems. And it's interesting that our own traditional naming systems were quite similar. So, for example, in my case, my own name is Chetachuku. My father's name is Chukwedo. So what I would have been called in the traditional Igbo sense would have been Cheta Nwa Chukwedo. And my father would have been called Chukwedo Nwa Chukudebelo. But what we are now called Wanze as a surname, that's the name of my ancestor 6 generations removed, the person who lived around the time the British conquered our part of Igbo land. So essentially names were frozen then. So but in northern Nigeria, what the British did was that they simply gave people. So, for example, Nigeria's first prime minister was Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. Balewa is the name of his village. So that's what's happened then. This going back to the topic that we're talking of, we had a lot of, I mentioned Johnny Smythe from Sierra Leone, who was a pilot for the Royal Air Force. That kind of story is something that will inspire a lot of young African boys. That as of the 1940s, we had a Black African pilot fighting in the Battle of Britain. Because, okay, he wasn't a pilot, he was a navigator. And he was shot down, his plane was shot down during the war. If we go further back, we had Robbie Clark, who was from what is now Nigeria, and who flew in the First World War, flew reconnaissance missions. We also had, and I keep forgetting his name now. This one, he didn't fight for Britain. He fought for Turkey, the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. He was from what is now Borno State in Nigeria. But the various countries that made up Africa, we had even, for example, we had a nurse, Aderele Ademola, who was
Princess Ademola.
Yes, Princess Ademola, who served in even
Guy's Hospital,
Great Gosh, and all those places. And after the war, she was completely forgotten, completely left abandoned. It's a travesty.
But is the story as old as time, isn't it? It's the story when you look at the Windrush, when you look at the NHS, when you look at even now, it's that thing of using a people to fill a need, but knowing only that these people are space fillers, they're expendable. And when the time comes, we will not just not acknowledge them, we'll pretend that they never existed. Let's go for a break, and when we come back, we'll look at the implications of this sort of erasure and what can be done about it.
No wahala.
Welcome back to the Black Paper. My name is Ndukwe Onoha.
And I'm Cheta Wanze. Before we start, I would like us to give a moment's silence for the dead. Since we're publishing this episode on the actual Remembrance Day, and it's an episode of remembrance. God rest the dead.
Cheta, in the first half, we spoke about, generally the contributions of Africans in the world wars, especially through forced, for lack of a better phrase, I'll say forced labor. And we mentioned people like, Princess Ademola, and a few other officers, Yoruba, who was from Senegal.
Private Adetoro, Samuel Sabongida, who were both shots. I think it would be nice to talk about Abdoulaye and Thierrye and Amadou Sarr, who were from Senegal and who campaigned tirelessly for their old pensions and obligations because the colonial authorities did not pay them. We talked about Johnny Smith, Robbie Clark. There was Walter Toole from Sierra Leone, who was the first Black officer in the British Empire to command white troops, and he got that distinction because on the battlefield he proved capable. As in, nobody could deny that this guy is a born leader.
He was gallant, as we like to say in Nigeria.
So
there's Albert Kinuku from Kenya, because we always, sometimes we forget that, East Africa played a huge role. And there's this, talking about the Burma Boys, you briefly mentioned Burma Boys. There's this
amazing and his menagerie.
Yeah, there's this interesting story of some man called Isaac Fadoyebo, who
Yes.
was, he served in Burma. He went voluntarily, who, according to him, during a fit of childish exuberance, during the war, was quickly shipped off to Japan, where he had to fight. Sorry, to Myanmar. Sorry, shipped off to Myanmar to fight the Japanese in the jungles of Burma, where all but he and another soldier were killed. But the Burmese villagers took care of him, and he was brought back. But again, like all
And
others,
he died not too long ago. He died
yeah,
just over 10 years ago.
yeah, but if not for the persistence of this uh journalist Martin Plot, we will not have heard of the story
Their
of
stories,
Isaac
yes.
Fadoyebo. So I think what we also need to do is to say a huge thank you to those who persist in showing that uh, those whose voices could not be heard by virtue of who they are and what they look like, that their stories could be told. Because it would be disingenuous of us to think that every British person or native English person has no one to tell the story of these soldiers. That's not true. So thanks to those. But you start talking about stories. Two things can be true at the same time. On one hand, there can be a deliberate erasure of the contribution of Africans to the wars. But on the other hand, there's also that negligence of our governments in saying, hang on, we have contributed much more than you're giving us credence for. So if the British, the French, whomever, if they refuse to tell our stories, does that give us the permission to refuse or to be negligent about telling our stories? Isn't it just lazy and unforgivable on our own parts?
So, what you have just asked, there are two things that I want to talk about as a result of what you have just asked. First, I think it's important. So, soldiers from the Gold Coast who had fought for the British in the Second World War were paid their pensions without fail after the war. Yes, their pensions were less than the pensions of their white contemporaries or their white counterparts, but they were paid without fail. Then the Gold Coast got independence in 1957 and became Ghana. This was in 57, and the pensions continued. Then in 1962, the pensions stopped. We can't blame the British for that. That was completely on the Ghanaian government, completely. And these guys, I forget the name of I watched the interview a couple of years ago. The one who campaigned tirelessly to try and get it reversed. From he was from Kumasi. So one of the interviews that he gave before he died, I mean, that generation, they're all but gone. One of the interviews that he gave before he died, he was actually very bitter that when the white overlords were in charge, their old money was coming. Then when their brothers took over, the money stopped. So we must call out the negligence of our governments back home. Secondly, there's a thing that we have, and this is something that I have fought for years. We have a way of, as a people, especially from the government side, trying to erase memory, especially memories that would seem uncomfortable. So, for example, I've campaigned because of the Asaba massacre in Nigeria during the Nigerian Civil War. My grandfather and a lot of my uncles were killed in that massacre. The Nigerian government, at an institutional level, has tried to shut me down. So there's this thing that we have about memory, where we try to erase or we just try to move on. And you see that discussion again and again when I have these discussions many times when I'm having. So for example, I'll give an example, and I won't name names, but Maxi Olun, the author, recently published a book, Nigeria's Forgotten Era. And 2 months ago now, when I was in Senegal, when I was in Dakar, I had my copy. I was reading, and a retired Nigerian general saw me reading the book and said, Marx is one of the problems of Nigeria today. And I'm like, how? And he said, all of these things, we should forget them and just move on. And he was very serious. We actually had, again, I mean, I'm not going to, I wasn't going to start shouting back at him, but we had a robust discussion. I mean, if I started shouting back at him, there was this thing of we could land in Lagos. I would just pick up the phone and some people would carry me and go and frog match me to, to exercise me very well. So I wasn't going to do that. But we had a robust discussion about history and his opinion, his belief. So it's no longer opinion. It's a core of his belief that we should move on. We should not, and my own opinion is no, you cannot, you need to understand why you are where you are in order to be able to get a situation, to be able to get yourself out of that situation. That's one of the problems that we have, especially in Nigeria. We like to forget.
Forgive and forget, we say.
Please. So what usually happens is that we end up forgetting, but not forgiving.
You're not
Because
forgiving.
all of these things leave marks that are not just Nigeria, but West Africa generally is full of wounds that have not been healed. And the only way to heal those wounds is to expose them to sunlight.
Nigeria is one large gaping wound. It's, in fact, it's not just a wound. It's different spots, different open sores all over the country, no matter where you go to. And because you have a point there, Cheta, because I remember I served in Yobe State, and I made.
Did you ever get to Machina?
No.
Oh, come on! You should have taken that trip.
Anyway, my brother, there was only one truck that would go only once. I come back once a week. I did not want to risk missing the return truck. But anyway. But interesting, I said in Guru, which was
at the time.
But the interesting thing, that was the time, because having grown up in the east of Nigeria and had almost all my, apart from my secondary education, which was at some point in Lagos, then in Benin and Port Harcourt. Every other thing was done in the east. University is secondary school, primary school, and all that in the east. So I had grown up with this flawed understanding that there was Igbo, Hausa, Yoruba, which is the very simplistic way in which we talk about the ethnic makeup of Nigeria. So there I am in Yobe State. And, I have this very, very good friend, and because he's tall, we call him Dogo, and very soft-spoken, until one day I make the mistake of calling him Hausa, because he's from...
He's probably Kanuri.
No, he's Benue.
Oh, even worse.
Even worse.
Kanuri people will not take that lightly, but... So I had a friend, Drawnell, once, and I actually made the error, and he's from Benue as well. I made the error once of greeting him in Hausa. And this guy, as in, anyway, let's not move away from what we are here for.
But the thing is that, and it's quite important, because when you choose to forget, and deliberately so, what you do is, to the untrained person, you're wondering, but you're from the, in quote, geopolitical north. Why would you be upset about this? However, there's a reason why, somebody who's from the north would want to say no. Even if you say, middle belt, and you being ignorant as I was, we think you're from the north, we think you're Hausa. Is the same thing when also people here, when you hear that someone is from Ghana, for instance, and you suddenly think that every Ghanaian is the same. You don't know that there's Twi, there's Accra, there's all these makeup. And what we do is we bury those years and years, centuries of history that make us who we are. Therefore, we're walking around with symptoms that we don't even know what the real ailment is.
But Ghanaians are the same now.
Look, listeners, that was Cheta, that was not me. So the Ghanaian, Charlie, if you don't be me top that one, no, but it's I think for us, I part of the reason I think we seem to not want to talk about these wars, whether it's the first war, whether it's the second war, is people don't want to go back to conversations around, okay, why did you fight? And then so you're talking about slavery, or you're talking about colonialism, or you're talking about the fact that some people actually joined voluntarily, because then it takes away from whatever narrative we've been trying to set about our people or our communities. But also when you look at and it's quite interesting, you see that certain people from certain parts of different countries were represented in some of these wars and some of these forces. And I think part of the reason why also people don't want to remember that is it then seems that, oh, these were the ones that fought on the side of the British, who were supposed to be, in quotes, the enemies, as it were. But it doesn't help anyone, because what we do is, while we, as you said, we forget, but we don't forgive, because the mistrust keeps being handed over from generation to generation. People don't know. Ndukwe doesn't know why he doesn't really like Cheta, but there's just something about Cheta that makes me not like him. But I don't know that I'm carrying on my parents' mistrust. And I will pass this on to my children to say, oh, if you see someone called Cheta, he's just avoid him. And Cheta will be like, Cheta's child will be to his own child, if you see someone called Ndukwe, just avoid him, because there's just something about them we don't know. So it behoves on us to expose our histories to sunlight, for the sake of our children, not even for our sake. I believe we're almost like a lost cause, but for the sake of our
We
children.
are a lost cause.
For the sake of our children, we do need to start revisiting our histories and talking about the good, the bad, the ugly. But no,
Yes.
that was a different rant from where we started.
I think it was an important rant. It's why I didn't interrupt. I think I would want to round this up with a book recommendation. It was written. It's called Firstborns. I think there are English versions available. It was written by Bakar Diallo, who was a Senegalese soldier in the First World War. In the colonial army, and he was conscripted. So basically, this a similar kind of story to what you told earlier. These tactics were used all around during both wars, where the village chief would be given a quota. We need boys from your village to come and join the army, or else. And the or else would be left hanging, not explicitly spelled out.
You fill in the blanks.
Yeah, but everybody knew that it could be very bad. And Diallo served in Morocco, or eventually made his way to Europe and fought on the Western Front, and he was wounded. And during the period that he was recovering, he began to reflect on the relationship between the colonial power and the subjects. So although he remained loyal to France, he became more, and that was one of the effects of both wars. So because of the speed, again, at the start of this, we talked about the difference in industrial power between the European countries and Africans when they came to our neck of the woods at the end of the 19th century. Because of the relative speed with which we were conquered by the Europeans, prior to the First World War, we looked at them as gods. But by the end of the First World War, that perception was beginning to shift. But more importantly, during the Second World War, especially remember that in the Second World War, for example, the British were conquered by the Japanese. And African soldiers witnessed this. So suddenly the mystique of the white man was broken. And these things helped to accelerate the calls for independence, because suddenly we realized that, hang on, these guys are humans like us. If you cut them like us, they bleed.
They bleed red.
And so the role of the world wars in African liberation cannot be overstated or understated. What we have done with that liberation after that is another discussion entirely. A. B. It doesn't excuse people from the actions of omitting the roles of African soldiers in those wars. I talked about the deliberate exercise by the Americans to
Exclude.
whitewash,
Oh,
to exclude
blacks and
the
Africans.
blacks and black Americans and
Mhm.
African Americans and black Africans who had fought for the liberation of France. Those things must be called out, and it must also be called out the action that is currently happening, where the U.S. has quietly removed memorials in Netherlands. It's the Dutch who are calling it out for black soldiers who died liberating the Netherlands from the Germans in the Second World War. That must be called out because that is whitewashing there.
And these not the same Americans that want to come and liberate Nigeria. But anyway.
Well, a week is a long time, as we said last week, and you can see that the talk has died down
Of
for
course,
now.
of course.
What remains
But
is for Tinubu to go to Washington and do his humiliation ritual.
uh, just on the to support what you said, about the contribution of the war to liberation struggles, there was this other Senegalese writer and filmmaker, Ousmane Sembene, who said that, having watched these white officers fall and, also lie in the mud as them, and people suddenly realized that there's no difference between people. So when a lot of these soldiers went back, they suddenly started. They were energized to start fighting for independence. What I'll say, I'll just say two more things, Cheta. First of all, I'll say a huge shout out to the 81 and 82 Division Royal West African Frontier Force, who were mostly, as the name says, West African soldiers who fought in the war from empire. Their sacrifices should never be forgotten, and as a way of paying homage to them, every remembrance service I go to, I wear a touch of yellow because their colors were yellow and black. It was a black spider on a green field, so we should look forward to, or look for ways, and this is the second thing, for African organizations, whether you're Kenyan, Ugandan, Liberian, whatever, in the UK and wherever you are, on Remembrance Days, two things. One, make sure you go out to those services, because it's not enough for us to call out the whitewashing by the authorities. By staying away and not honoring your forebearers, you also give people license to say we were not a part of these liberation struggles. So go join those services, but also wear colors that would honor them. Find out, from wherever country you are, find out what the color of your regiment or the regiment from your country was. Wear it on that day. Be proud about the sacrifices made by your ancestors to the peace or to the security, relative as it may be, that you enjoy today. So whilst we wait for many of the governments on the continent to wake up, we have no excuse as people who live in these climes for not remembering our fallen. I'm done, Cheta.
Yeah, I noticed. So, I mean, you've spoken profoundly. I think given that you've name checked 81 and 82 Div, it's important to point out that 81 Div is largely now the Ghanaian, or their descendants are largely the Ghanaian and the Sierra Leonean armies, while 82 Div is largely the Nigerian army. So I think just for context, although of course there were people from either sides who were also in both as well.
Yeah.
With regards to remembrance, yes, it is right to remember, and you can't take that away. What I personally kind of fight against is the compulsion to remember. So there's this what some people call poppy fascism. And that's a streak of rebelliousness in me comes from not here, but from experiences in Nigeria.
Yeah,
where
I know where
I
you're coming
remember.
from.
Yeah, I remember because our own Remembrance Day in Nigeria is January 15th, and 40th Remembrance Day. And I remember when my awakening started, and I began to realize that, hang on, it was the Nigerian army that killed members of my family. And so it's the Nigerian army that has been involved in a lot of massacres. We
Like the
also
Asaba
need
massacre,
to,
we must always remember. We
the
must
Asaba
never forget
massacre, but
the
not
Asaba
just the Asaba
massacre.
massacre. I mean, the events which made a lot of people in our wave leave Nigeria. The Lekki massacre. So
EndSARS.
between the
Lekki
Asaba
massacre.
massacre and the Lekki massacre, which is the last famous one, there've been quite a number. There's been Onitsha, there's been Ugep, there's been Bakolori, there's been Umwechem. There have been so many. Remember, don't forget Odi, Zaki Biam. There've been so many. So in remembering soldiers who fell in wars, we must also remember the victims of massacres perpetrated by those soldiers. It's very important. So when we say God rest the dead, we're not just talking of the soldiers, but we're also talking of the civilian victims, the civilian casualties.
Well said, Cheta. Very well said. And on that note, that's a strong and powerful enough note to close this episode. So I'll see you at the next one, Cheta.
See you next week.